my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Bethany. Jonathan is the head baker and co-owner of Salut Bakery in Washington, D.C. Jonathan has had a very interesting career journey, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that. He began his professional training at Michael Sauce's San Francisco Baking Institute. He's worked at the Washington State University's Bread Lab, and he's been experimenting and developing ever since. So, Jonathan, that introduction probably doesn't do you justice, but with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mark and Krista and NCI for having me here this morning. Very honored, and it's very much my pleasure to share a little bit about myself and our story and some of the work we're doing. Boy, it's different for me looking at a black screen, or at least I see Mark now. So just want to make sure before I begin that everyone can see and hear. Okay.
Looks good.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's hard to tell on my end.
We've got a lot of the participants saying no problem. Yep, can hear you just
fine. Okay, yeah, maybe I should pull. There we go. There's the chat part. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I thought today that I would talk a little bit about, briefly about my history and about the origin of the Salut project, basically, how it came to be, what's going on, and where it's headed. And I also wanted to talk about some of the unique aspects of this project and why it's important, or why I feel it's important for our time and for future. So I'm going to share my screen now and bring up some photos. And this is how I'm going to do it. Okay, can everybody see that okay? All right, great.
looks good.
Okay. Let's see, there we go. I'll keep Mark there. All right. Great. So that's just, I needed a picture just to kind of so I didn't give away the beginning of the story. So. But yes, grains. Why grains? How did I get into grains? I didn't always be into grains. I wasn't always into grains. My background is more so in music and philosophy and religious studies and cultural studies. After a bunch of world travels and adventures, I started home baking as a hobby, and that eventually turned into a career. And one thing led to another, and I ended up in school. There's Michelle Suez, and I had my training was very, I think SFBI out in San Francisco is it's probably one of the best schools at the time. Certainly it was for artisan baking, but it was also very much rooted in traditional French style. So we were baking artisan bread, but it was, we never learned where the flour came from. Or I remember in our textbook, there was a section with a picture of a farinograph, alveograph, and some other rheological equipment. And I'm like, well, this looks cool. And the instructor kind of looked at it and he goes, "You're never going to see this in your career, so we're just going to skip over this." So, little did I know, I'd be looking at that stuff a lot later. But what I got to say is really good basic principles of craft baking were taught here. So was my foundation. It led to several jobs in the Bay Area, and that's kind of where I made my formation. This is an Allen Scott brick oven in the Marin Headlands, just north of San Francisco. I worked about 3, 4, 5 jobs, really burned myself out, wanted to kind of throw in the towel on baking altogether, realizing that how much work and little payoff it was. You can see I'm kind of withering away there. And, you know, I had to dig deep to find purpose and meaning in what I was doing. And, you know, this was also during the gluten-free movement. And all I'll really say about the gluten-free movement is I think it's the best thing that's happened to bread and bakers in the long run. In the short run, I think it was very painful for all of us. Um, you know, the thought of, you know, when most bakers start baking, it comes from their heart, and it comes from a deep desire to serve and to create like healthy, nutritious and wholesome food. And to be told that that's poisonous to people or harmful to people is a devastating blow to a baker. So, and the whole reason of being there. So, through the existential crisis, though, I think the bakers who bake in the way, you know, I saw Andrew had a wonderful presentation last month. There's a movement of bakers out there that were vindicated by this whole examination. And I think gluten-free really did us the favor of scrutinizing the whole value chain, scrutinizing, you know, how it was grown, what we're applying to our seeds, what kind of insecticides are, you know, getting covered, is the grain getting covered in that doesn't actually get reported on, or it doesn't have to be, there's no disclaimer required for it. I mean, there's all kinds of little caveats and pieces that we had not looked at that might be affecting our health and the soil's health and our, the greater environmental health, and is deep. So I thank that movement, and I think maybe a lot of bizarre stuff came out of it, and some bad science, you know, led people into strange diets. But in the end, it's good that we took a look at what's going on. So that was during this time. Coming out of that, it helped me to discover whole grain baking, fresh milling, organic farming, small craft operations, breeding for objectives that really fit into a holistic regenerative system, both agronomically and in baking. This led me to one of my early mentors was Craig Ponsford. He, I think, was the early pioneer, the earliest that I know of that opened up 100% whole grain bakery in the United States. He was doing laminated doughs, and I remember, and breads, and I remember eating one of his croissants. And usually when I eat a croissant for breakfast and have a coffee, I wouldn't feel so good. Or maybe not just a croissant. It wouldn't usually just be a croissant. It'd be like a croissant, you know, Danish and some other things, muffins, sweetbreads. So, you know, when he offered me up a plate of pastries for breakfast, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to get a sugar rush, and then I'm going to crash, and I got to work later. So, but I don't want to be rude, so I'm going to go ahead and have it. I ate what he made, and I felt like I had just eaten eggs, whole grain toast, vegetables. I felt like I'd eaten this whole meal, and I was eating pastries, and there was no crash, and I had energy throughout the day. And that, to me, was a light bulb went off that there's a different way to go about this. And he also really encouraged me to pursue different kinds of grains that I had not heard of before, and to seek out bakers who were doing their own fresh milling, such as Dave Miller out near Chico. And Dave was another mentor of mine who really showed me the value of fresh milled flour and bread, and just the nutritive and flavor difference that made, and how to turn that into whole grain bread as well, that could compare with the tartine, you know, country kind of white loaves out there that are delicious loaves, and were, you know, they're, at this time they were dominating the kind of the bread scene. Had become popular, especially with the Tartine's book coming out, and a lot of people were trying to imitate this style of high hydration, country style bread, and whole grain wasn't looking so good compared to this bread. Thankfully, Dave has had a method of baking which gave you that same supple, open crumb, and really made for something that I felt was even more enjoyable than the country loaf. So he also, you know, had a lifestyle that was a big wake-up call for bakers like myself who were overworked and finding themselves, you know, not quite able to make it in their career financially and physically. He had figured out a system where he was happy and healthy and creating healthy products for his community, and he really just seemed to have it together. So it was very inspirational for me. So I landed a job. Man, I look so much younger in that picture. But I landed a job at the WSU Bread Lab after this. You know, starting to find my purpose. And this is actually in the California Wheat Commission. I had to go do a training before I could go to the Bread Lab. So I spent, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks, 10 days, 2 weeks out there training on the rheological equipment and learning about what they do out there.
Hey, Jonathan, not to interrupt, but we did get a question. So the prior you were talking about the baker that figured out, right, the lifestyle and how to make things work. Mm-hmm. Somebody's asking, what was his name and where was he from?
His name is Dave Miller, and he is he's based in Yankee Hill, California. It's near Chico. I can't remember where he grew up, but he had studied under Richard Bourdon. He'd been over to France and Germany, and you know, he owned a larger bakery in Chico for a number of years, ended up selling that. And this was also a fresh milled bakery, but then he used what he'd made from that to, you know, buy a homestead. And he's got a solar powered home and bakery. His oven is wood fired, and he has llamas and terraced gardens and a beautiful family, and he's just a real cool dude. Both of those two are kind of unsung heroes. I think people know about them in this genre of artisan baking, but they're not. None of them put out books. You know, Craig teaches at a school in California now, so he might be out there a little more. I mean, he made big waves in the '90s when he beat the French at the World Cup with a baguette. Like he put American bread on the map in the '90s. Because prior to that, we were known for our Wonder Bread and kind of lack of craftsmanship when it came to bread. But he helped. He gave us a lot of pride there. So he became famous, started a bakery, ended up losing that bakery for various reasons and moving away from it, and opened up just a little tiny place called Ponsford's Place where he did experimentation. That's where I met him. So my path led to working with Dr. Jones, pictured here at WSU. And I worked for 3 years for him, with him. And I just learned so much about breeding, farming, about the purpose of breeding, you know, about the objectives, what kind, you know, an alternative approach, I'd say, an approach in which I would buy, you know, that really helps bakers like myself, where, you know, I can't say that's the case across the board, and that's okay because there's all kinds of bakers out there. But Steve really championed, you know, flavor, nutrition, quality. low inputs. You know, a lot of the characteristics that I look for now. So this is the early bread lab. There's now a big fancy bread lab up there, but this is where it all started. And you see it split into two. And I put that brain there because it was like two halves of a brain. You know, the right side is that creative, intuitive side. And you see that's basically a small craft bakery. We got the mill mixer. There's a bigger mill we had too, but that one looks nicer. Mill, mixer, and oven. And on the other side, there's some rheological equipment. And that's the analytical and data-based side. So together, they really work in harmony for evaluating varietals for craft bakers. And it wasn't just bakers, it was, you know, we did tortillas, we did pasta, we kind of like the NCI, we tried to be varied in our approach and to really innovate in how many value-added products we could come up with within, you know, with working with these different varietals here grown on site. And yeah, it's just, there's a whole world of, you know, as breeders especially know, it's just, I mean, this isn't even a fraction, but it just gives you an idea. If you just look at all the different colors and shapes and, you know, of just the wild, wonderful world of grain diversity. It's incredible. And that's, as a baker, it's something I wasn't really aware of, you know, until having this experience. So that's Bethany. Yeah, she's you know, removing some of the parts to make a cross. So, you know, Steve really pushed the issue of whole grain on me. You know, I had been into whole grain previous to that, but he made it mandatory and pushed me to innovate whatever, you know, to come up with it, whatever I could with wheat alone, any flavors I want. He used to, you know, really discourage, you know, throwing a handful of nuts and seeds into bread to change it, you know. Rather, he said, find those qualities in different varietals, find them from different ways of, you know, treating the grain, if you're roasting or popping or malting or, you know, sprouting, or, you know, let's find some different, let's see what we can do here with just the grain itself. And so, you know, that's 100% whole grain baguette back in 2013. This was a malt bread. I wanted to get a sweeter bread. So, you know, with sprouting and drying, you can malt the grains and they, you know, a conversion of starch into sugar occurs and you can get a natural sweetness. So I'm just coming up with some neat stuff. Eventually, a lot of attracted the attention of a lot of bakers, a lot of guests, a lot of chefs. There's you know, kind of all the heroes I'd had as a young baker were now coming to the bread lab, and we were experimenting together and learning together, and it was a really wonderful time and a real intentional collaboration, you know, we've had going, and I believe still goes on there. So during this time too, I did take one of the formative moments was taking a journey to France and visited this small town called Sacanay, and you know, they had, it was the paysan boulanger at its best, and meaning it's this movement in France where you have the farm, the mill, and the baker all on the same premise, and serving the community. And you know, the farmer there is just incredible. He was doing a lot of polycropping. You can see there's some lentils here growing with the grains. And how he combined all this stuff, I'm not sure, but he had several wheat varieties growing at the same time. he had, I guess, really coordinated their maturation times and got them really accustomed to one another. So they were like a family. And he was just so thoughtful in his production and so thoughtful about the land. And with, we'll talk more about this, but, really implementing the principles of, diversity and soil armor and nutrient density. And, it really blew me away. And I saw, hey, this is a way to farm and make grains or make food that, nourishes the earth rather than takes away from it. And the baker there was able to transform, all of the elements of the field into their bread. So they'd incorporate, I didn't see the lentils go in, but different oil seeds and even different flower seeds and things like that. So it was cool. Part of my journey after after the bread lab led me to, consulting. And I'm pictured here at Blue Hill at Stone Barns and Pocantico Hills in upstate New York. The famous Dan Barber had been working with Steve prior to me starting there, but when I started, I just kind of fell in with what they had begun and started making trips out there and consulting with him and helping him on his bread program and his visions. And I learned so much from him about creating a cuisine or creating a product that was in line and in harmony with soil health. And Dan has done a lot with working with breeders. He's worked, with NDSU even, and he's just been a real inspirational figure, I think, for many. And he has a new company called Row 7 Seed Company, and it's a breeding initiative which really takes this holistic approach with soil health, flavor, functionality, agronomics, all into consideration. So really cool stuff. Okay, whoa, okay, what happened here? I had some visions and it felt time to start my own thing. And those visions would take another, maybe a little novel or something to write. I mean, it's probably not appropriate for this presentation. So I'm going to skip that story, but let this picture perk your imagination. And if you'd ever like to hear more about the story and the vision behind Selu from another angle, from an intentional and deep spiritual angle, feel free to reach out at some point or contact me. So I needed the tools for the trade, and here's one of Andrew's awesome mills. Andrew and Blair really, that was a game changer creating these mills. The mill is the crux. The mill is, I think, the main facilitator in the value chain. That's the real nexus between the farmer and the consumer. Like you can't, there's only so much you can do with whole grains unmilled. So this is the gatekeeper and really opens the doors. So I sought out this mill in particular because of its the quality of the flour that it produces. As a 100% whole grain baker, it's imperative that I am in full control of the flour particle size and starch damage. Andrew's mills really did the job for me and continue to do so. And that comes to the premise on, what kind of bakery did we want to build? We wanted to build a bakery that really honored the holistic approach to the value chain with integrity through every step. What I didn't want to do is to just open a bakery, make some cool, awesome bread from all the things I'd learned, declare victory, and take all the credit and praise and, oh, awesome, that mission accomplished. It's just, if I could go completely opposite, that's what we're intending to do. In that, this has to do with more with the farmer and the cleaning and the seeds and the community around us than it does the baker. We're just a link in the chain here and doing our job, trying to take all the integrity that went into the intentional farming, and I'll get to that and a lot more into detail about that, taking that same integrity and doing what I can with my part. So I'm not a scientist. I spent some time with scientists, but I'm not a scientist. I spent some time with farmers, but I'm not a farmer. What I am is a baker, and I've spent a lot of time baking. So that's the that's the angle that I can take here. But I feel like it's important to learn for a baker nowadays and for the future. It's important to learn about farming. It's important to learn about science. It's important to learn about seeds. It's important to learn about food security and all the issues that we're facing around that. So that's where the baker really becomes empowered. That's the difference. And that's what I teach our staff. That they're not just cogs in the wheel. That they have the power to to change things for the better.
So Jonathan, talking a little bit about science. So a question came in. You produce some gluten-free breads, correct?
Yes, yeah, we do.
So the question is, somebody commented that they see that the crust of your gluten-free breads are relatively dark. What are you doing in your approach to limit the acrylamide in the crust?
There's not as much acrylamide as you might think. And I don't know if Dr. Shania is here, but I asked her this question, about acrylamide. And, she, due to this, I can't answer you in the scientific way that she could. But, there's a Browning effect with the Maillard reaction that often gets mistaken for char, and it's not char. It's dark because the dough is dark. We're not putting white things into the oven and them turning brown. We're putting brown things into the oven and they're coming out like coffee. So I do, on the other hand, I do bake very dark. So some of my bread, some of like the edge of the ear, we call the ear when the dough opens or the bread opens like this. Sometimes that edge will actually get a black stripe on it, and that literally is char. So, but from what I've been told, our bread is about as healthy as it gets.
Thank you.
So having the tools for the job, this is a 20-ton masonry oven. I found for this kind of bread making that is, employing high hydration, fresh milled flour, long fermentation, large loaves, I really needed thermal mass to be able to get a thorough bake on our products. So this oven, it's similar to like a black oven, which is where you load all the wood in, build up the residual heat, and then empty it out, and then bake in that same chamber. This one you can see that the firebox is below, and so the heat is generated below and circulated around that chamber, baking chamber, which is actually a wheel. So it's a circle suspended from the top that you can turn and kind of bake in and out. It's kind of a proto production oven before like a deck oven. And I chose it because of its thermal mass and because it's fun. I mean, half of baking has got to be fun, right? I mean, so it's a really difficult, but at times, but enjoyable oven to use. So, okay, out in Senegal, out in Millet. Sorry if the pictures aren't quite, I guess that's part of the surprise. It's surprising me too. Okay, so this picture is taken out in Senegal. So just previous to opening the bakery, I did take a trip with the USDA out to Senegal. I have a history with Senegal dating back about 10, 15 years. And you know, they had heard about the work that we're doing here at Sailor using integrating local cereals into the bread. And I went to consult on a millet project. Senegal produces no wheat, but just about everybody eats between 1 and 3 baguettes a day made out of white flour. So all that grain is imported and is of relatively low quality, such that it has to be enhanced with chemicals. So the chemical companies are in there with enhancers, as well as the yeast companies that are instructing bakers to use way too much yeast. I'm assuming to sell more. And I know this because I judged the best baker in Senegal contest in 2018. These are the 4 finalists here below, and absolutely sweet and humble and talented human beings. The way that they've been taught to bake, unfortunately, was appalling in that, and it was all to facilitate. See, this is where you say the disclaimer. These views are not, you know, these are my views, but basically the way they were taught to bake was to feed the system of, you know, big companies, yeast and chemical, and I don't want to go too much into detail with this, but let me give you an example. So you're in a place where electricity can even be hard to come by, and to mix a baguette, they are instructed to use ice, tons of ice. Why? Is because they are mixing the dough high speed for so long that the dough heats up. So they are mixing with, instead of water, with ice. So when ice is hard to come by, why are you using ice? Why is there so much yeast in the bread? Why does the formula have to have so much yeast in it? And this is coming from, you know, what is taught at the flour companies and the yeast companies. And anyway, you know, and then using dough enhancers, all this stuff. So, but the gentleman right above me, his name is Amadou Gueye. He is the president of the National Federation of Senegalese Bakers. He's spearheaded a program to incorporate more of the local cereals, such as millet and sorghum, and corn, and even herbs, natural superfoods like moringa and bisap into the bread supply. And so during this competition, the kind of the factor that really, the theme of it was incorporating these local cereals. So I thought that was super cool and a huge step ahead. And here you can see some different colors of the baguettes with some of the different cereals mixed in. So coming back from this experience, just really, it made it a deep impression on, you know, what is a diverse system? Why is it important to, you know, incorporate not only local grains, but local other cereals besides grains? And yeah, I'm a little out of order here, but that really led me to Next Step Produce. Led me to this gentleman, Heinz Tomet. He comes from Switzerland originally, several generations of farming. And he has a farm that has basically completely inspired the Selu menu. We have based our menu completely off of what he grows, but even his rotational crops. So often he'll get a double crop, and I'll explain a little bit more. He's known, you know, also known for growing crazy things like kiwis and yuzu and stuff like that on his farm. So he's got quite a reputation among the local artisans, even vinegar makers. He's just very diverse in his approach and willing to try things. So
so you're talking about growing kiwis and his crops. Where is he based out of?
He's in Maryland, so he's about an hour and a half drive south of our bakery. So
thank you.
There's a few other farmers. We work with about 4 or 5. This is Daniel Shirk out in Newburgh, Pennsylvania. He grows wheat and camelina seed for us, rye as well. Omer Byler. A lot of our wheat and corn and butter and dairy comes from him. Yeah, he's animal integrated. So with Heinz at Next Step, most of our produce comes there. So at Seilu, all of our produce, all of our dairy, all of our proteins, all of our grain comes from the region, 100% of it. So that was one of the principles that we wanted to establish in this bakery. And its vision didn't come at first. It really evolved over time. I mean, the idea was there in the beginning, but this gentleman, Heinz, was a big inspiration in that. When I first met him, he walked me around his fields and he showed me, the wheat and oats and, rye and barley and rice and millet and sorghum and buckwheat, and there's some cane sorghum up there you can press into syrup. That's one of our main sweeteners, so sorghum syrup, and beans, and he took me around, and when we got to the wheat, I was like, okay, how much of this can you sell me? And he's just like, I just have a couple tons, but. And I'm looking around in his fields, or he's got about maybe 30 acres planted, and I'm like, what does he mean? Just a few, maybe 8 or 9 tons. And he's like, this is what it takes if you want wheat, if you want to grow wheat without adding hundreds of pounds per acre of fertilizers, and spraying pesticides and herbicides, and this is what it takes to do a real natural and regenerative system. You have to rotate. You have to have diversity. You can't be solely focused on yield. So it was an eye-opener. I made a commitment then and there to use his whole farm and to use these other crops and explore them. And these crops are so good for you. Millet, it's so full of minerals, and sorghum and buckwheat. I mean, it's not even just about the grain. Look at all the pollinators that it's going to help, all those flowers. So these are ecosystems. This is a holistic approach to farming that I had not seen on this level. I mean, there's a lot of fantastic small farmers around the country, but Heinz is just the integrated ecosystems that he's developed are just are moving. And so we'll take every year we take our bakers in front of the house and our staff out to learn and to experience his farm. And I really feel for a baker or anyone in the industry, this is a very important piece of it. That their story needs to be told, because folks like this are, I really feel, are going away. I mean, the average age of the organic farmer is around 60 years old. I mean, where are the young people? So what's going to happen when they're gone? You need the new generation to take this on, and what they need is a market for it. They need a reason. If you look at the suicide rate amongst farmers, it's incredibly. I think it's higher than that of veterans. Heinz has had mental health officials come out and ensure that his mental health is okay because of the risk that's out there. I mean, they're taking the greatest risk, and especially growing in this way, and not going for not going for the subsidized, not going for corn, soybeans. And I mean, he's taken a tremendous risk, so he needs someone on the other end He needs, and that's who we are. That's who Selu is we're the person on the other end that says, we support what you're doing. We're going to hang on. We're going to hold hands together through this, and we're going to pay you what it takes to do this. And so, that's quite a higher price point than, I could be buying bagged flour delivered to my doorstep for, I don't know, 50 cents a pound, even organic from the Midwest. Nothing against the Midwest. It's far from us. So there's a lot of carbon footprint there. Already milled everything. And, it costs, $1.50, $1.70, from Heinz, and he's an hour and a half away. But the way he's doing it, I want to support what he's doing to his field, what he's doing to his soil. In the 15 years he's been there, he's added 1.5 inches of topsoil. So he's healing the land. His farm used to be a tobacco farm, was smashed by tobacco for 20 years. I mean, his fertility levels were abysmal when he first started, and he's bringing it back to life. So I see such hope in this, and we want to support this, and we want our guests in our community to support this, because we're all connected together. And it's one chain. And if the earth goes, we're next. So he uses techniques like, cover crop, just a lot of biomass there, building organic matter, diversity, and it's beautiful. And look, making a habitat for the pollinators. There's a whole field of mustard. It's just, and we'll use that. We'll use the mustard seed. He also uses mainly compost. He's not animal integrated, so he's reliant on compost, and he does amend with trace minerals from evaporated seawater with the salt removed. I think it's called like sea crop. And he's big into what's called the term escapes me, but basically building building nutrient density in his crops, but also in the soil, by adding these trace minerals, rather than the kind of big, potassium, nitrogen. He's focused on a more holistic approach that mimics nature. So we also work, with our local university. On top of one more thing about Heinz, I just got to say, part of why I asked him why it's so expensive, and part of it's that he does so much research. So he'll grow about 5 or 6 new varietals every year in tiny plots, and to see how they work. And he is pretty much a one-man show. And so it is a ton of time and energy and work to see if something may or may not work. But that's, we do those test plots together and evaluate them together. So that's one end of it. They're usually older varieties. We do some new varieties too. We notice for the low input system that the old varieties tend to do better. Basically, I have a picture here. I'll show, you'll see it later. But if you pump these old varieties, they're not high response varieties. So if you pump them full of nitrogen, they're going to get super tall and fall over. And that's why a lot of people say they don't work, but they actually do pretty well in a low input system. The short varieties, it makes sense. That's got a strong short stock. You pump that guy full of nutrition, full of fertilizer, and most of that goes into the head, and you're going to get a high yield. So, it's like, what's your target? What are you going for? Why would we use an older variety? Often, there's more flavor. Bakers tend to like the older varieties. They're usually easier to digest. Not across the board, but there's a lot of qualities in them, a lot of biomass. Um, you know, like Heinz, he's making compost here. He needs a lot of organic matter, so he needs a lot of straw and stuff like that. So um, on the other end, you know, with science, it's imperative. You know, when it comes to disease and when it comes to disease and adaptability. Um, and going for certain traits, you know, we can't always find that by field selection. So working with the local breeder is really important. As you know, as long as we're in alignment with, you know, shared values, at least for, you know, a specific project, it's so valuable. I'm so grateful for. This is Dr. Vijay Tiwari, and he just started at University of Maryland a couple of years ago, and he's been working with us on fusarium resistance and taking some of these heirlooms, some of these older varieties that have qualities we like, and adding in fusarium resistance, because fusarium is what's really, really crushing us here. Head blight, you know, scab. So you can see that just a little bit there, at the bottom of that wheat head. Where is that part? So it's important. Testing is important. Yeah, that's, you know, I think that's some Abruzzi rye that just bit the dust in a windstorm. Things get too tall here. They, you know, that can become a real pain for the farmer trying to harvest that. And if it gets wet and sprouts, then it's going to be a real pain for me. So, so to some of our process, you know, I'd say that we do use a lot of, we you know, since the 100% whole grain bakery, all the all the grain, all the flour that we use is milled on site through Andrew's mill. So we are completely reliant on our mill right now. And the reason I did that is because there just was not if there was a mill in town that made the quality of flour we were looking for, I would have rather gone with that. But since there wasn't, we had to do an in-house mill. And, you know, we mill probably, I don't know, probably close to 50 tons or so a year, maybe a little more, maybe like 60 or 70 tons a year of local flour. And, you know, it's thirsty, whole grain, it's unsifted. So it's got all the bran, it's got all the germ, it's got all the oils. So we use it within a day or two. Use it fresh. It's like fresh produce, fresh orange juice, fresh coffee, you know, has those aromatics. It's a different product when used fresh and milled cool. And so, you know, a lot of our doughs are really wet. And why is, you know, the bran just absorbs so much moisture. It really requires a lot more water to get a nice supple dough with whole grain. And so when you have such a wet sopping dough, you really have to bake it more thoroughly. And that also leads to that darker crust. It's not that we're trying to bake things dark. It's just that's what it takes to actually bake it through.
So you talk about the shelf life of the flour. How long will your bread? What's essentially the shelf life of your bread?
I mean, most of our breads are about a week. I mean, just in the bag. So okay. Some maybe 5 days. The baguettes maybe 3 days because they're so narrow. They lose moisture faster. But yeah, there's kind of like, it's amazing what. So you're working in a whole grain system, and it's like, what can you make out of all this stuff? And you know, I don't want everything just to taste like whole wheat bread. So that's where the creativity comes in. If we're just using red wheat, you know, for everything, it's all going to taste like red wheat. So with white flour, you have kind of more of a blank canvas to explore flavors and textures. And, you know, when you're using whole grain, it's just going to taste like wheat. So, you know, using other things like, you know, rye and buckwheat and millet and sorghum and einkorn and spelt and emmer, using whites and reds, and you know, it's just a real creative experience here at Selu. Nixtamalizing, malting, um, employing a lot of not only flavorful techniques, but healthful techniques, like nixtamalization for corn. I mean, it makes it really gives you complete absorption, gives you all the niacin. Amazing the native peoples, discovered that so long ago when the settlers came and were just, getting sick eating the corn. And, these folks that were here before had figured it out long before. And if you cook it in their ash water, it actually makes it fully absorbable.
So is most of your baking done sourdough or what?
Yeah, I'd say for bread, like 95% of it. Nothing is purely yeast. Everything's got some. Even our croissants have levain or sourdough in them. So most of the bread is 100% naturally leavened. Again, that was to give some diversity. Like if I want like a loaf like this, I'm going to use, it's not white. It looks light, but I'm using a hard white wheat. And I'm using a little bit of yeast as well. So it lightens up that flavor profile, lightens up the crumb a little bit. And you can see we can get this big, supple, chewy interior with 100% whole grain flour. So that's one genre of bread that people enjoy, and that's usually about the toughest one to do for whole grain. We can do those dense, dense Danish rye and heavier breads, but this is a little trickier.
And earlier you were talking about milling. What particle size do you focus on? And you talk about managing starch damage. How much starch damage do you find is acceptable?
I don't have numbers to quantify that. And since we don't sift, I don't have a screen size that I can say I like, but I bet you it's probably below 100, or below maybe 200, maybe 150, 200, fine. But some of the brands bigger than that. So, maybe 100 or so microns. Maybe even a little less, because sometimes the brand, sometimes the brand's huge. If you have a real soft like spelt or something, and it just powders that endosperm, and the big brand is like it's like cornflakes. I could crank down and try to pulverize that, but I would end up pressing too hard. So I'd say it varies. Our rye, we tend to mill coarse. When I mill millet, I like the millet coarse. So it depends.
And so starch damage, are you saying a lot of it just comes down to experience and feel and
For us, yeah, I can't give you a quantification other than that we see how the dough starts performing. And we also notice a lot of it's with the mill when it becomes dull and you have to push harder to get a fine flour. You start seeing, the dough gets really juicy and sugary, and it gets dark. The bread gets even darker, and you start having problems. Our mill, we usually sharpen the mill about 4 times a year, and it starts off like with a little bit coarser flour, then it hits this real nice sweet spot, and that lasts for a few months, and then it starts to get, the flour is still pretty fine, but it's because you're just really mashing. It's more pressing than it is grinding, and that's when we know it's time to sharpen. So the starch damage is like on a curve, and it just, for us, it has to do with sharpness of the stones.
very good. And then your friend, was it Heinz, the farmer?
Yeah.
So roughly how many acres does he farm?
His farm is about 50, but he's got a natural habitat. He's got forest and an irrigation pond, and so I think he only probably farms on 25 or 30.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah, and these are some of the elements from there. So I said, okay, Heinz, we got to tell the story. Let's do this polycrop bread called a horse bread, and that's the origin of one of our best-selling breads called horse bread. And you see, it's got a lot of soil enhancing ingredients there. It's got It's got legumes. That's going to be your main nitrogen fixer up there in the top left. And it's got camelina, and it's got mustard for the pollinators. It's got millet and sorghum. And those are important for rotations. And every grain, like rye and oats and barley, they pull different stuff out of the soil and give back. So it's really important to diversify. And so it's also incredibly nutritive. I mean, all the omega-3s in those camelina seeds, and the complete protein with the wheat and the beans, and then you get all the minerals from the sorghum and the millet. It's just a really, really healthful and delicious bread. So there's it baked. That's the horse bread.
And the camelina seeds you're putting in whole, right? You're not milling those, grinding those.
Yeah. We also do oil, and we use the oil in some of our other products. Oil is really nice. Try to get away from the olive oil because that's not local. So almost like our pizza, it's almost 100% local. There's, another example is the harvest loaf. That's with the nixtamalized corn and millet and rye. So most of our breads are not just wheat based. And the ones that are wheat based, it's about 6 to 8 different varieties in there. I don't think I have any single variety breads. And the reason for that is with the farmers we work with, they tend to grow a diverse array of varietals every year. And I want to try to use all of those, even the ones that don't work well. And that's kind of one of our specialties, is mixing and matching. And that comes from the whole bread lab training. Kind of like a mill will have a tech who will take all these different flours and blend them to spec. So a flour performs consistently before it goes in the package. We kind of have to do that in the bakery and change throughout the year, like constantly change our formulas to make it work, depending on supply and performance.
So question came in: how soon can you use the flour after you mill it?
I mean, as soon as it hits the bottom of the barrel.
And you said we
don't age. I mean, aging is common, especially with white flour, and to let the disulfuric bonds strengthen the flour, and a little bit of oxidization. We know that the flour gets stronger and more stable if it ages, but you lose aromatics and you lose, I believe, access to like those oils. So in the same way, so we choose to go with freshness.
And then on average, what do your breads weigh?
I mean, they vary, but they're around a kilo, of dough or more. I tend to do bigger breads, and that was in part because when I started, I was by myself and figured I'd do big breads and cut them in half, so I wouldn't have to bake as many. Yeah, and you can see the price. I mean, they're not cheap, and that's something we struggle with. How do you make cheap food without using cheap ingredients? And it's just like, or cheap, rent, or it's like other things need to be cheap for the food to be cheap, or there needs to be some kind of subsidy or something. But to get nutritious food from the farm into the city, into the inner city, is not going to be cheap. So that's where we really need help from our the institutions and governments and charities out there, is to make that bridge, nonprofits. And we do work with DC Central Kitchen, which rehabilitates former inmates and homeless, and it's a culinary program. We have interns that come in from them, and we work with food rescue. All of our anything left over goes to food rescue, various food banks and pantries. And then I'm working on a program. I'm having to start a nonprofit because I couldn't find a program to subsidize the cost of this bread for school systems, institutions, and just to make it accessible for those who just can't pay $12 to get a wholesome loaf of bread. On the other hand, it's like for us average folk, of middle income who would balk at paying $12 a loaf of bread, I would say there's more nutrition in that than 12 of your Wonder Breads that you could buy for $1. You could probably actually mash them all up and fit them inside of that loaf of bread. And so there's a lot. You get what you pay for in terms of sustenance goes. In terms of integrity, that money is going to help heal the earth. It's going to pay employees that actually have a career in baking, because I've chosen not to mechanize and to make it, these bakers, it is a trade for them. And so they get paid like it's a trade. It's a career for them.
There's another technical question. Is there a storage temperature that you store your flour at before baking?
No, but that would be awesome. That'd be great. I mean, it definitely keeps a lot better. I think in the mid 50s is great. I mean, that's going to affect your mixing and stuff if it's cool like that, but it's nice and fresh. I wish we could. Our space is really small. If I could, I would keep it probably around 55, 60 degrees. Because it keeps bugs down too. There's a lot of reasons why cool is good.
So we're running a little bit over, but if you want to take a couple minutes and wrap up.
Oh man, I thought I wouldn't. Sorry.
You're good. It's a good conversation and
rambling. We'll just cruise through here and we'll get the questions. This is Charbel, my pastry chef. Speaking of intentional collaboration, he's originally from Venezuela, hated whole grain baking, then fell in love with it. He is responsible for the pastry program. Together we've worked on coming up with, that's 100% whole grain croissant with local flour and local grain milled in-house into flour, and local butter too, local milk and eggs as well. So kind of doing the impossible here. That's a sorghum oat cookie. Again, using those alternatives, gluten-free. Our chocolate chip cookie is a millet chocolate chip cookie, so it's also gluten-free and 100% millet. Working with Heinz's Farm, is we put this twist on things. That's buckwheat. Our muffins are 100% buckwheat, so they're gluten-free as well, with an oat crumble on top. So building a menu out of these other crops, get really value-added products, from what are normally just kind of cover crops or underutilized grains. So that's the crux of all this. That's a canelé, a traditional French pastry made out of millet exclusively. There's not even rum there. Well, I don't drink alcohol as part of it, but the flavor is coming from the millet itself. It's so flavorful. These alternative grains are just packed with flavor, and so you don't need as much sugar. You don't need as much like liqueurs and additives to scented waters to make it flavorful. I mean, the grain itself is the star of the show. This is our cover crop granola. That's with popped sorghum, buckwheat, and seeds. So, and oats, of course. So we come up with other things, pasta. A lot of guest chefs come in, explore. We have a pizza program, 100% local pizzas, sometimes a little olive oil, I admit, so maybe 99%. But even the salt is coming from West Virginia. And these are like the vegetables that come in from places like Next Step Produce. And we try to use the same farms that are integrated that have vegetables as well. We try to buy from those farms also. We're buying grain and from, and vegetables. But if not, there's a lot of great organic farmers around us for produce. And just, those are some hand pies in the works, kind of, we grew up with eating Pop-Tarts, but this is like the healthy Pop-Tart. And I leave you with this. This is Heinz walking, with a former baker of mine's son, Moses, across his fields, and they're right in front of a compost pile. And I just want to draw attention again of the generation, of great men and women like Heinz they are the reason why I can do what I do. They're the reason why we have the nutrient dense foods that we have available to us. And when they go, I just feel like a lot is going to leave with them, a lot of wisdom, um, a lot of stewardship, a lot of heart. And I feel like as business owners, that's what we need to do, to keep them going and to support them, and so that they can keep supporting us. Well, that's it.
Very good. Well, thank you for the time. This it's always an interesting conversation, Jonathan. So thank you for your time this morning. I think you've answered a lot of the questions as we've gone throughout. Um, so thank you for your time, and thanks everyone for tuning in here today.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for the opportunity.